In 2012, the Greek economy did something no government had deliberately planned for it to do. It shrank, and it kept shrinking for years. GDP fell by 26% over 8 years, a contraction worse than anything the United States went through during the Great Depression. And it happened in a modern European country with full access to global markets. Nobody had planned that. Nobody voted for it. It just happened because the money ran out. And there is an entire school of economic thought that says rich countries need to do something like that deliberately, in a managed way, to save the planet. That school is called Degrowth, and this video is going to give it a fair hearing because the question at the center of it is one of the most consequential questions being asked right now. Can you save the planet without killing the economy? To understand why that question is so hard to answer, you have to go back to where growth came from in the first place. Because the engine that built the modern world was not designed to be turned off. For most of human history, people did not grow richer from one generation to the next. An English farmer in 1650 worked the same fields, burned the same wood, and yielded the same harvest per acre as an English farmer in 1450, because the energy available to him had not changed. Muscle, wood, wind, and water were the only inputs human civilization ever had, and those limits did not move. Then coal arrived, and it broke that ceiling completely. Look at what a single ton of coal actually contains, the energy equivalent of what a healthy adult could produce working every hour for 3 solid years. A coal-fired steam engine could do in one day what a village of people could not do in a season, which meant British factory owners started producing things faster, cheaper, and in quantities nobody had ever seen. Britain's output per person doubled, then doubled again, and within a century every country that wanted to compete was burning coal to do the same thing. What followed was the most dramatic reduction in human suffering ever recorded. A child born in South Korea in 1960 had roughly a 40% chance of dying before age 5, because South Korean families in 1960 were farming with tools and methods that had not changed. And when harvests failed, children died. Whereas a child born in South Korea today has less than a 1% chance of dying before age 5, because the factories and exports that industrialization made possible funded the hospitals, the clean water networks, and the public health systems that actually kept children alive. That engine, coal feeding factories, factories feeding wages, wages feeding hospitals, hospitals keeping children alive, is exactly what Degrowth says rich countries must now wind down. Science is not wrong that we cannot keep running it the way we have been running it, but the bill for 2 centuries of burning has come due. In 2006, an economist named Nicholas Stern, commissioned by the British government to calculate the cost of doing nothing about climate change, handed governments a number they have been quietly sitting with ever since. His finding was that if countries kept burning and emitting the way they were burning and emitting, the permanent damage to the world economy would land somewhere between 5 and 20% of global GDP. The worst single year of economic pain in modern history, the 2009 financial crisis, shrank the global economy by roughly 2%. Stern was describing something 10 times that size, locked in permanently. That number has a face, and it lives in places like Bangladesh, a low-lying delta country whose southern edge sits barely above the surface of the Bay of Bengal, the warm, shallow sea that forms its entire southern border. Farmers there are already watching salt water push into their rice paddies as the sea level rises, and at 2 degrees of warming, Bangladesh stands to lose roughly 17% of its total land mass to permanent flooding, which means millions of farming families displaced from land their grandparents cleared by hand. The countries whose industries did the least burning are being handed the largest bill, and that is not a rhetorical point. It shows up in the data, the projections, and the displacement numbers. And that gap between who caused the damage and who absorbs it is exactly why the proposed fix, asking rich countries to deliberately shrink, is so much harder to sell than the physics alone would suggest. So if burning is destroying the planet, and the cost of doing nothing is catastrophic, deliberately pulling back should be an obvious answer, except the moment you ask, who pulls back first? The entire conversation falls apart. So what do degrowth advocates actually want. They are careful to say they are not asking for a recession, because a recession is something that hits an economy from outside, like a bank collapses, markets panic, workers getting laid off. What degrowth proposes is something governments choose. They look at the steel mills, the cement plants, the container ships burning heavy fuel oil across the ocean, the beef, feedlots, the entire physical backbone of how rich countries produce and consume. And they decide to run all of it at a lower volume, on purpose, while redirecting the money saved toward housing, healthcare, and clean energy, so that the economy shrinks in tons and barrels, but not in the things that actually make people's lives better. The problem is that nobody has worked out how to make the step down land on the right people. When Greece's economy contracted by 26% between 2008 and 2016, nobody chose that either. And what actually happened was the opposite of what degrowth theorists promise. Landlords and factory owners moved their money out before the bottom fell, while workers, pensioners, and nurses, rationing antibiotics, absorbed the entire weight of it. But the harder problem sits outside Europe entirely. 700 million people alive right now survive on less than $2.15 a day. In countries that have not yet built the factories, the roads, or the hospitals that would give them a different path. Telling those governments to skip the industrial model that lifted South Korea, Taiwan, and China out of poverty before their own people have had a chance to use it is not climate leadership. It is asking the people who burned the least to pay the most. The thing I kept coming back to while researching this video was a genuine disagreement between two groups of serious people looking at the same data and reaching completely opposite conclusions. And I want to walk you through both sides because neither one is being dishonest. The first group points to something you can actually measure. Since the 1970s, American factories have been using less steel, less aluminum, less water, and less energy for every dollar of output they produce. The United States today gets more economic output from a unit of energy than at any point in its history, and the gap between 1970 and now is not small. Economists call this dematerialization. The economy grows in dollar terms while its physical appetite shrinks, and if that trend continues and accelerates, countries can keep producing prosperity while the damage they do to the atmosphere actually falls, which would make the entire degrowth debate unnecessary. You might be thinking at this point, if rich countries are already using less per dollar of output, why is anyone still worried? Because the second group has a response that carries real weight. Look at how long it actually takes an energy system to change. Britain started burning coal in the 1760s and did not run primarily on coal until the 1830s. 70 years of transition, even with enormous profit waiting on the other side. The world started building oil infrastructure in the 1860s, and oil did not overtake coal globally until the 1960s. Now governments are asking the entire planet to move away from fossil fuels in 30 years, while simultaneously replacing every combustion engine, retrofitting billions of buildings, and finding clean alternatives for cement and steel manufacturing. Industries that have no proven zero-carbon process anywhere in the world yet. And then there is a problem that almost nobody in this conversation talks about honestly. When a European steelmaker shuts a furnace to cut domestic emissions, the steel does not disappear. A mill in Turkey or Vietnam fires up instead, often with dirtier coal and weaker regulations. And the carbon enters the atmosphere there instead of Europe. The European country gets to report lower emissions. The planet does not get lower emissions. 3 countries have already lived different versions of this problem. And what happened to each of them is the clearest picture we have of what actually happens when governments try to act. I want to show you what this actually looks like because Germany tried harder than any country on Earth. And what happened to Germany is a warning nobody in this conversation wants to say out loud. In 2000, German politicians made a decision: phase out nuclear power, phase out coal, replace both with wind and solar, and keep German factories, the backbone of the largest industrial economy in Europe, running at full capacity throughout. But when Germany shut its nuclear plants, 8 reactors went dark between 2011 and 2023. And wind and solar were not yet producing enough reliable power to fill the gap those reactors had covered. So, German grid operators filled the gap with coal and imported natural gas, which meant Germany was burning more fossil fuels to execute a plan designed to burn fewer. Electricity prices for German households climbed to roughly 38 cents per kilowatt hour by 2023, compared to around 13 cents in the United States. Chemical plants, glass factories, and steelmakers started moving production out of Germany because the energy bills had made them uncompetitive at home. BASF, the largest chemical company in the world, a company that had been making things on German soil for over 150 years, announced it was permanently cutting its German workforce and shifting investment to the United States and China, where energy was cheaper. By 2024, Germany's new Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who leads the center-right CDU party, stood in the Bundestag, Germany's federal parliament, and said what the previous government had spent years refusing to say, that Germany was deindustrializing. And it was not bad luck. It was the direct result of politicians shutting down reliable low-carbon power before the replacements were ready. Denmark sits across the water from Germany and tells a different story, but understanding why requires one piece of context that usually gets left out. Denmark never had a large, heavy industrial base to protect in the first place. Its economy ran on fishing, shipping, and services, which meant Danish politicians could phase out fossil fuels without threatening the jobs of hundreds of thousands of factory workers. They also started building wind capacity in the 1970s, which meant by the time wind became the primary power source, the infrastructure had been decades in the making, and no industry was ever left scrambling for power during the change. And since 1990s, Denmark has cut its emissions by roughly 70%, while its economy more than doubled in size. Vestas, the Danish wind turbine company, now sells to the entire world, which meant the transition became an export business rather than a cost. Denmark's story is not that the transition is easy. It is that the order in which you do things and the kind of economy you start with determines whether you end up like Denmark or like Germany. And most of the world is starting from Germany's position, not Denmark's. And then there is India, which has been watching both of these unfold and has drawn its own conclusions. India is the world's third largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, and it has 800 million people who have not yet reached the living standard that industrialization made possible across the West. In 2023, Indian power companies were opening new coal plants at a rate of roughly one every 2 weeks, because India has large domestic coal reserves, and the government in New Delhi has made a calculation that Indian families cannot wait a generation for clean energy to become affordable. And when an Indian government minister who represents a country where 400 million people still lack reliable electricity gets told by the representatives of countries that industrialized on coal over 150 years that India needs to skip coal, invest in expensive clean energy it cannot yet afford, accept slower growth in the near term, and in exchange, receive climate financing that the wealthy countries promised at international summits and have repeatedly failed to deliver, does not give too much of a trust. Here is the part of this story that does not resolve cleanly. The people who suffer most if governments do nothing about emissions are the Bangladeshi farmers already watching salt water push into their fields, the Pacific Islanders already moving their villages uphill, the smallholders across the dryland belt of Central Africa, whose rains have been arriving later and leaving earlier for a decade. People who did not build the problem and will not be in the room when the decisions get made. And the people who suffer most, if rich countries pursue aggressive cuts without financing everyone else's transition, are the exact same people, cut off from the development path that has lifted more families out of poverty than any other approach in recorded history. And even the optimistic answer, just switch to renewables and keep growing, runs into a problem that does not get talked about in this debate. Solar panels do not generate power at night. Wind turbines stop when the wind stops. In a country like Canada, where winter temperatures in large parts of the country fall to 30 or 40 below zero and stay there for months, depending on weather-driven energy for heating and power is not an environmental preference. It is a survival question. In every country that sits at northern latitudes, Canada, Norway, Finland, Russia, faces the same arithmetic. Renewables can supply a large share of electricity in favorable conditions. But the moments when demand is highest are often exactly the moments when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing, which means some form of firm, reliable baseload power has to exist underneath the renewable layer, or the whole system fails when people need it most. The honest version of the clean energy future still has an unsolved problem at its center, and pretending otherwise is how you end up burning more coal, not less. The answer that actually holds up is neither degrowth nor burning indefinitely. It is a carbon price high enough that clean alternatives become cheaper than coal everywhere, not just in countries that can already afford the upfront cost. It is clean energy technology transferred to countries that need it rather than licensed to them at prices they cannot pay. Can you save the planet without killing the economy? The honest answer is probably yes, but only if the people designing the transition stop treating it as a solved problem. Stop pretending weather-dependent power is sufficient on its own for countries where the weather turns lethal, and stop asking the nations that cause the least damage to absorb the largest share of the cost.